Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. Of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone to make that last courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off. It's always appreciated by our speakers and those recording our events. Our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. And we, of course, will post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Hosting our discussion this morning will be James Roberts, our Research Fellow for Economic Freedom and Growth in the Center for International Trade and Economics. He primarily focuses on the production of Heritage's annual Index of Economic Freedom, but he also studies economies and political issues in Latin America and Europe, as well as development and assistance and nation-building issues. And of course, as you'll see today, we focus on Asia in relationship to the index. Before joining us here, he served at the State Department for 25 years with tours of duties in Mexico, Portugal, France, Panama, and Haiti. But opening our program today will be a special guest for us. Making our introductory remarks will be the president of the Heritage Foundation, Senator Jim DeMint. Will you please welcome Senator DeMint?
Thank you, John, and thank all of you for this great work. It's one thing to do an index that measures how free economies are around the world. It's quite another to follow up with recommendations of how to make it better. So it's exciting that we've got a how-to manual here today. And that's the whole point, is to introduce a global agenda for economic freedom, which have a lot of ideas that would help us here at home. Today we will be focused specifically on Asia, but the report is much broader than that. It outlines what regional governments should do around the country to expand opportunities and freedom and prosperity around the world. And this is a complement to our Index of Economic Freedom, which, as you know, is published annually and read all over the world, probably more outside the United States than it is here. Part of our challenge is to get Congress and the administration to look at those things that are working in other parts of the world. The index grades 179 countries. The global agenda prescribes specific corrective policies to improve economic freedom. This is something we're asked a lot by countries who don't like their ranking, who come by and try to find out how do they move up that ladder of economic opportunity. This is a well-timed event. As all of you know here, I'm leaving for the Pacific tomorrow morning. First stop by Hawaii. It's all work in Hawaii, I guarantee it. Then to Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and Hong Kong. We've got a lot of friends around the world, particularly in Asia, and a lot of them want to hear what you'll be talking about today, so that's a lot of what I'm going to be doing. The two most economically free economies in the world are in Asia, Hong Kong and Singapore. Australia and New Zealand are right behind in the top 5. So this is something we can go to school on, but countries that have been listening to policies from Heritage for a long time and have become freer and freer. It's home of 60% of the world's population, and its share of the world's GDP has risen from 24% in the year 2000 to 34%, just over a decade. Incredible growth. So Asia has emerged from a global financial crisis that the whole world experienced, stronger than it was before, and is expected to become the largest economic region in the world within the next few decades. The U.S. does more trade with Asia than any other region of the world, and with the passage of what we hope is a truly free Trans-Pacific partnership, we'll see more and more trade. We hope that that agreement actually does liberalize trade relations, and that's something we're going to be looking at. So the 12 trading partners of the TPP represent $1.4 trillion in total trade. So it's a big customer group for us, a lot of allies in the world, democratic nations, and they're going to be very interested in what you're hearing today. So folks, thanks for putting this together and sharing it with the world this morning.
Thank you, Senator DeMint, and thank you for coming out this morning as we launch our 2014 Global Agenda for Economic Freedom. As you know, it is a sort of a niche product of our 20-year-old Index of Economic Freedom, as Senator DeMint mentioned. And I just thought I would review a little bit about the backdrop against which we will be discussing these problems in Asia and the recommendations that Heritage has in our global agenda. These economic freedom issues are important because people benefit when they are implemented, the policies, the core principles and policies of the Index of Economic Freedom. As the scores go up, poverty rates go down, and that is very important in Asia. As you know, some of the scenes of some of the most difficult challenges for poverty, but also some of the greatest successes in fighting against it without resorting to statist sorts of development model assistance that have failed in other parts of the world. There are correlations with social goods indicators that are important, that everyone wants: healthcare, education, a better environment. All of these correlate strongly with better performance in the Index of Economic Freedom. And once you are on a trend, once the trend is set and the governments and institutions are committed to the path of more economic freedom and the principles of rule of law and open markets, then those benefits continue for 5, 10, 20 years, the entire time we've been doing it. We now have 20 years of data available on our website to anyone who wants to look. Per capita income, these are all, even within regions, you can see stark differences between countries that do well in our index and those that do poorly. Some of our leading nations, and some of them Senator DeMint will be going to starting tomorrow. And but still, too many people living in countries without economic freedom, especially the big balloons there, China and India, but 4.5 billion people in the world still in countries with scores lower than 60, which is the minimum a country has to have an overall score in the index to be considered at least partly free. Unfortunately, the United States has been going in the wrong direction for the last 7 years and losing ground in our Index of Economic Freedom every year, and this year completely dropped out of the top 10. Now today, with the global agenda for economic freedom, we just wanted to show you a couple of the features of it. They have, in addition to narrative descriptions of problems and issues and then recommendations about problems in the regions or with specific countries, we also have progress charts as to whether countries and regions have done better or worse. In Latin America, for example, you see the Pacific Alliance countries have been deepening and expanding their cooperation and agreements along the Pacific rim of South America and Mexico. They have been given an up arrow as making progress. On the other side is Venezuela and the ALBA countries, which get a down arrow for even worse problems than the year before. With regard to Russia and Ukraine, the same thing. In fact, Russia made some positive changes to their central bank policy in the last year. But Ukraine, as everyone knows, is an extremely difficult situation. And even without the aggression of Putin, has major challenges with regard to embedded corruption, even worse corruption than in Russia itself. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. William Wilson, former chief economist for Ernst & Young. Bill Wilson has more than 2 decades of experience directing economic research for both commercial enterprises and not-for-profit institutions. He's the senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center, concentrating on analysis of economic performance of Asia-Pacific nations and educating Asian leaders on the principles and practices of free markets. Before joining Heritage earlier this year, Bill headed economic and financial research for Skolkokov's Ernst & Young Institute for Emerging Market Studies in Moscow. In that capacity, he coordinated economic research for all the large emerging market countries. I guess he was 3 years in Beijing and then started an office for the Institute in Moscow, where he lived for 2 years. And Bill tells me that while he has joined us at Heritage, and we're delighted to have him, a lot of his money is still stuck in Russia. So I'll let him explain that a little more. Earlier in his career, Bill managed one of the largest economics programs in the Gulf region, serving as executive vice president and head of economic research for the National Bank of Kuwait. In the 1990s, he was vice president and senior economist for Comerica, the U.S.'s 10th largest bank, and he has masters and PhDs in economics from Purdue. So please join me in welcoming Bill Wilson. Thank you.
It's the up button, right?
Yeah, or the arrow in there.
This is,
Just use this one.
okay. Good morning, great to be here. I'm a neophyte, so I think this is my first speech. And yeah, I've left a large portion of savings in Russia, can't get it out, but I'm trying to get it out before the Russians invade southeast Ukraine. I think after that it's over, I'll never get it back. I work for the Asian Study Center with Walter Lohman. Obviously, we're focused on the Asian region. As the senator said a few minutes ago, it's the largest continent in the world, 60% of the world's population. At last count, I think we're at 48 countries in Asia, if you include Turkey and Russia. Its share of world GDP has grown from 25% at the turn of the century to 34% just last year. Historically speaking, that's a big climb in a very short period of time. Asia contains the world's largest democracy, which, as you know, are holding really critical elections this month in India, which could determine India's future. India needs a big smack. India needs a big bang, and they need it now. So you should be watching the election results in India. They're very important. India should be growing at 10 to 12% a year. They need to be doing it for a full generation. So they need a big, this election in India has to be a big bang. U.S. now does more trade with Asia on a bilateral basis than it does with any other region in the world. In fact, right now, we do 50% more trade with Asia than we do with the European Union. Asia's share of world exports have risen from 22% to 32% since 1990, and it's symmetrical for imports, those shares. Asian imports from the rest of the world have grown from 22 to 32% over the same period. Asia is the largest holder of U.S. debt. China and Japan alone hold about $2.7 trillion of U.S. federal debt. Now, a lot of you may sit back and say, these numbers shift in Asia. This big rise is largely a Chinese phenomenon. That's partly true, but remember, there are a lot of fast-growing countries in India right now. You have Indonesia, Malaysia, Kazakhstan, South Korea, Vietnam, Hong Kong are all growing fast. But this has been, over the past 20 years, largely a Chinese phenomenon. Right now, China, in 2013, China accounted for 45% of Asia's GDP. So it's quickly approaching one half. And the catch-up is breathtaking. At the start of the century, China, in dollar terms, only accounted for 4% of the global GDP. Today, it's 12%. It has tripled its share of global GDP at current exchange rates, not PPP, current exchange rates in just 12 years. What's amazing, if you go back to 1977, a year before the reforms began in China, Deng Xiaoping was going to take his entourage to the UN and visit the U.S. for the first time, and he needed $40,000 to take his entourage to the UN. They couldn't find it. They went to the People's Bank of China, the only bank at the time in China. They went everywhere across the country. And the last minute, they were able to find $40,000, but it took them months. Today, China has $4 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. The transformation that we've witnessed the past 30 years is the most important economic event of our lifetimes. And you probably heard last week, measured at what we would call purchasing power parity, adjusting for the differences in the cost of living. Right now, China has matched us. For the first time since the 1870s, when the U.S. surpassed Great Britain as the world's largest economy, we now have another big boy in the block. Whether you agree with the numbers or not, the fact is this: China may be 10% smaller, 15% smaller than the U.S., but the fact is it's close. They're almost our size after 35 years of growth of 8 to 10% of world GDP. Now, that said, I believe a financial crisis in China has become inevitable. I think the crisis is coming. The only question is how big it will be. Because the state controls the largest financial institutions, a result has been an explosion in credit in China and in much of Asia. After 2008, net exports were no longer a driving force for the Chinese economy. Investment took up the slack, domestic investment, running close to 50% of GDP for a protracted period. If you go back and look at the miracle growth spurts in Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea during the late 1960s and 1980s, investment as a share of GDP was never that high. It might have reached 35%. This is the first time in history where investment as a share of GDP has been so high at 50%. Some estimate that the total domestic credit could be as high as 200% of GDP when factoring in the shadow banking system, which you hear so much about. The soaring debt and growing inequities are putting enormous pressure on China to abandon its current economic model, because so much of China's growth has been excess reliance on credit growth. A protracted period of deleveraging would put credit growth below nominal GDP growth. This would put an enormous deceleration in credit growth over the next few years. This is needed in many important industries. Capacity utilization in many key industries in China, like the steel industry, are below 75%, i.e. there's a ton of excess capacity right now in industry all throughout China. And given the continued weakness in the global economy, this time the Chinese are not going to export their way out of the situation. This could easily lower gross investment share of GDP from the current 50% to a more sustainable 30%, where it should be over the longer run. This, however, would produce a very sharp decline in GDP. Also, last year, for the first time, the working age population in China actually declined, a trend that's set to continue for the next 2 decades. Unless the country can raise the labor participation rate, China will struggle to expand its labor force by even 1% a year. To sustain growth of just 7% then implies that productivity would have to grow 6 to 7% a year to compensate. This cannot and will not happen. So, in short, what I'm saying, China does not have many good options. Any real reform would probably trigger a severe financial crisis and recession. No reform, and this is a key, I'm going to take one thing home today, this is it. No reform, on the other hand, delays the inevitable, making the economy even more imbalanced than it was before, and making the eventual pain much more severe. Either way, we're looking at a hard landing for China. I'm not saying China won't reach the promised land. China will eventually exceed the size of the U.S. by a very good margin, but it won't happen without a crisis. A crisis, I think, is inevitable. Now, just a few more words in terms of our publication, the Global Economic Freedom Agenda that we rolled out last week. The Asia-Pacific region made the greatest gains in economic freedom of we have 5 regions, right, Jim? 5. I think it's 5. Yeah, 5 regions over the past year. Again, it's a tale of 2 cities, tremendous regional disparities. I mean, you got Hong Kong, you got Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. They're all in the top 10. Globally, they're all in the top 10. And but yet, most of the other countries, the other 48 that I mentioned earlier, mostly remain mostly unfree as we defined it. Then you have North Korea. That hellhole of North Korea remains last, the least free in the world. I mean, that country remains least free on any index you look at. So the Asia-Pacific region ranks above the world average in fiscal freedom, government spending, labor freedom, but it's still very corrupt. Much of Asia, I mean, India, China, Indonesia, Vietnam are extremely corrupt, and so they're rated very low in those categories. So one of our themes for Asia this year that was resurrecting privatization. After almost 3 decades of privatization worldwide, the role of the state remains unfortunately, remains very strong, if not dominant, including in Asia. We've seen very little progress over the past year. In Vietnam, only 2 weeks ago, where state-owned industries still dominate the economy, a recent initial public offering did not go well. There was absolutely no interest in Vietnam's IPO. The banking sector remains dominated in the emerging markets. Many are state-owned, especially in India and China. And this shows the Chinese benchmarks Shanghai Composite Index. What percent, and China has the second largest stock market in the world after the U.S. The stock market capitalization is $3 trillion. What percent of China's listed companies do you think are state-owned enterprises by market capitalization? 30%? 50%? No, it's 80%. So despite 10% economic growth, if you look since 2007, had you put all your savings into Chinese stocks in 2007, by today, you would have lost 2/3 of your savings. The fact is, because of this excess capacity in China, there's been declining rates of return on invested capital, and so the old Chinese model that worked so well for 30 years, export-led growth, large increases in fixed asset investment, infrastructure spending, that economic model is expired, and it has to move towards privatization. Jim, I'll stop here.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. Now we have really delighted to welcome to Heritage John Murphy, the Vice President of International Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and good friend of Heritage for many years, to respond and give the perspectives to the global agenda from the U.S. business community. John is responsible for representing the Chamber before the administration, Congress, and foreign officials as he directs advocacy efforts to open international markets for U.S. exports and investment. Since joining the Chamber in 1999, John directed its successful campaigns to win congressional passage of trade agreements with a dozen nations, including most recently South Korea, Colombia, and Panama. He plays a key role in the Chamber's work on international business priorities, such as regulatory cooperation, international investment, trade facilitation, and the work of the World Trade Organization. Of course, all of these are very core parts of our Index of Economic Freedom. So please join me in welcoming John Murphy. Thank you.
Well, Jim, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and really an honor to be here today. I consider myself not just a longtime fan of the index, but a student of it. In my career, having read it over many years and charted the course of the progress of economic freedom around the globe, and the agenda as well, as you say. It's I think the business community can find a great deal there to strongly support. On the headline issues, I think from the perspective of the business community, we would be largely in agreement that there's a good story to tell, even though I'm probably going to spend more time talking about the problems that business faces in the Asia-Pacific region. The progress continues. We do see a number of remarkable performers in the Asia-Pacific region, as Senator Dement pointed out as well. We do see a trend towards lower tariffs. There are more trade agreements to push those down, even though in a number of markets they continue to be quite high. Just to give one example, Malaysia, which is an important economy, one of our top 12 or so trading partners, the auto market, for instance, has a 35% tariff. That's pretty sky high by modern standards. Another area where we've seen a lot of progress in the Asia-Pacific region is in the area of what we call trade facilitation. Trade facilitation is that package of reforms that make it faster, quicker, cheaper to move goods across national borders. And this is really an area where APEC, which in many ways can be sort of a glass half full organization, APEC has really accomplished something significant here. On several occasions, they've set goals of reducing the transaction costs of trade by 5% in the region. They've met those goals. And it's the reason why today the Asia-Pacific region outperforms, say, Latin America, including economies that are at higher income levels. So doing business across borders in the Asia-Pacific is something that's become significantly easier to do over the years. I would say, though, that in looking at some of the problems the business community faces, we have cause to be concerned about trends in recent years in a number of markets as well. And often these come under the rubric of what's known as state capitalism or economic nationalism. It's no coincidence, I think, that the reemergence of state capitalism in some countries coincided with the financial crisis in the United States and in Europe and the recession that we suffered, which was really a blow to the free enterprise model in the eyes of some around the world, even though many of us would analyze that and not ascribe the blame to free enterprise. But nonetheless, it's a reality that there has been a renewed emphasis on the development of state companies. Let me start with a little case study, which you're probably familiar with, many of you. China, over recent years, unleashed a plan known as indigenous innovation, which really, in some ways, captured the intent of some of these economic nationalist policies. The Indigenous Innovation Plan, as it first rolled out, brought together policies having to do with government procurement and intellectual property and standards. Under draft rules in 2009, firms were required to gain accreditation for their products before they could be included in the procurement catalog. So if you wanted to bid on for opportunities to do business in China's trillion-dollar procurement catalog, you had to meet certain requirements. And those requirements were that the intellectual property embedded in your product had to be devised in China. Well, this is, you can see what the Chinese were trying to get at here. There's actually an understandable interest in moving up the value chain, moving away from being a producer of low-end manufacturers. But this kind of heavy-handed approach was one that attracted a lot of concern around the globe. Dozens of business organizations and governments from different countries protested, and the U.S. government did as well in the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade and in the Strategic and Economic Dialogue with China. And the Chinese ultimately walked back from many elements of the plan. Nonetheless, the intent here of using the tools of state power to give advantages to domestic production and to state enterprises is real. Let me walk through a few of these in a little more detail. The challenge with state enterprises is there's many different elements to it, but one that I would point to is that at times U.S. companies doing business in Asia find themselves competing in the market against state companies, state-owned enterprises that are not only players in the market, but sometimes they have regulatory powers within the market. I think that's, on the face of it, you can see the conflict of interest that exists there. One example of that is Japan Post, which not only competes with express delivery companies, but also provides insurance and banking products. And this unfair competition is something that's objected to not just by foreign enterprises doing business in banking or finance in Japan, but by Japanese companies as well. Another area that we see state capitalism unfold is in national ownership requirements. For instance, in Indonesia, there was an attempt under the postal law to ensure that only domestic companies could own express delivery companies. This is especially important in services, where often the only way to do business in services sectors is to invest and be present in the market. Control of natural resources is another area that we've wrestled with in recent years. This is perhaps most prominent in the rare earths dispute, which went to the WTO. China was determined by the WTO dispute settlement process to have engaged in policies that restrained the export of these rare earths, and by doing so lowered the price of these important inputs in the Chinese marketplace, creating a powerful incentive to produce in China. There was another case called the raw materials case where they did this with some other industrial products such as bauxite. Anyway, it's an important issue that the world economy has been wrestling with, and it's relevant here in the United States as well, where some have suggested that we should not allow the export of liquefied natural gas, and in doing so, push down the price of natural gas in this market, affording an advantage to domestic production. So there's an element there of a lesson that the U.S. would do well to take to heart. We see this in the use of regulations and standards, which can also afford advantages to domestic enterprises over foreigners. We see one colorful result of this is known as the Galapagos syndrome, where unique domestic standards help foster a national champion whose size in the local market is not really a true indicator of its ability to compete on the global stage. We see it in competition policy, antitrust, and this is an interesting area that is really, I think, just emerging in some ways. In fact, if you went back 20 years, there were only maybe a dozen significant antitrust authorities around the world. Today, there are more than 100, and many of them are still in the process of developing their procedures and figuring out what is the way that they should carry out their mandate. Unfortunately, we do see plenty of room for mischief here. We see antitrust actions that are carried out not really to benefit the consumer, but to protect producers. And it can be a tool for protectionism. In China, for instance, there's a great deal of concern in the business community about the way the anti-monopoly law, the AML, is being implemented nowadays. We hear this from many companies. Unlike trade and investment policy, however, there aren't international rules. The WTO, for instance, has no norms on antitrust. So what to do? I think the agenda that Heritage has put together is an excellent starting point on this, and I'll just comment on a few of these. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a very significant opportunity. I agree with the thesis that no one is going to endorse this agreement before it's concluded, and that's true of my organization as well. But we have high hopes that in the end it can be an instrument for promoting economic freedom as well as the benefit of consumers and producers among the dozen countries. Just in passing, I'll say, we, at the Chamber, we're huge supporters of our free trade agreements. We have them with 14 of them with 20 countries, and even though they represent just 10% of the world economy, they buy nearly half our exports. In fact, they purchase 12 times as much U.S. exports, or as many U.S. exports per capita as other countries. And according to a study we commissioned, they support 5 million American jobs. The expansion of two-way trade supports 5 million jobs. We hope the TPP will do this as well. We hope that it's a comprehensive agreement covering all goods, all sectors, and that includes U.S. sensitivities. Take sugar, for instance. This is an area where U.S. Very strong limits on imports of sugar have kept the price artificially high in this market. So we need to put our sensitivities on the table as well. We think that the TPP should push back against digital protectionism as well. We need to see trade liberalized not just for goods and services, but for digital goods and digital services. And we see in a number of markets efforts to promote what's called forced localization, where companies are required to store their business data on domestic servers, which of course is not how companies are trying to do business nowadays. The TPP, as it is proposed, will have a chapter on state-owned enterprises specifically, to require national treatment, meaning that state-owned enterprises are required to act like any other private company in a commercial manner in the marketplace, so that they don't have the advantage of being a regulator of the market that they're operating in, so that they don't receive financial advantages through state lending. On antitrust, there are provisions requiring due process and transparency. This is something that we've strongly backed. Antitrust proceedings, as I was mentioning, because in many countries these are novel institutions, it's a bit of a black box, and the way that rulings are reached or the way fines are set seems arbitrary. So this effort to ensure due process is an important one. Of course, the protection of intellectual property. Many U.S. innovative companies and innovative companies from elsewhere are entirely dependent on protection of intellectual property. Take a pharmaceutical product, it costs $1 billion to conduct the clinical trials that will show the safety and efficacy of a new medicine. But that medicine can be easily copied. So we need to see if we're going to have an incentive for further innovation and creation of new medicines, then protection of intellectual property is important. The agenda also mentions the importance of renewing the generalized system of preferences. The Chamber is a strong supporter of that. The business community is a big beneficiary of that in the sense that a lot of the goods that come in under GSP are inputs for U.S. manufacturers, but similarly, U.S. consumers benefit. The free movement of people is an area that's of interest. You mentioned the visa waiver program. We're very interested in seeing that expanded. When Korea joined it a couple of years ago, there's evidence that it's been a huge facilitator of travel and tourism, which supports many jobs in the U.S. and in Korea. Another important item I would mention is there's an ongoing push now to conclude the negotiations to expand the product coverage of the World Trade Organization Information Technology Agreement. Of course, most of the world's ICT goods are produced in the Asia Pacific, often with final assembly in China, but with many goods elements coming from the U.S. and throughout the Asia Pacific. The first ITA, which is dates from 1996, helped usher in a massive expansion in trade in ICT goods, which is now about $4 trillion annually. But it's been a long time since 1996. Your phone, Bluetooth, this TV, all of these products didn't exist then and are not necessarily covered. So expanding and updating that is something that's very important. And we're in the final stretch here, and hopefully the Chinese, who are probably going to be the biggest beneficiaries of it, we hope that they can get over some of their resistance to some of these last issues there. And a final one, and concluding again here with China. China, as Bill alluded to, as the Chinese authorities have talked about, they know that their model needs to change. There's talk about moving away from heavy industry and towards services, reducing the preponderance of emphasis on exports and looking more at the domestic market, more on services. And this is, I think, why China has proposed to join the TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement negotiations. Doing so would help them advance goals that they've already set for themselves. And that's something that we think is worth considering in time here. The business community, though, is hoping to see those negotiations proceed a little bit further and see the negotiation take more form. We don't want to see the negotiations watered down and the agreement become weaker. So, in closing, I would just say there's a lot of commonality of views here, and I congratulate the Heritage Foundation for this agenda, which is clearly very much in the interest of U.S. business and U.S. consumers. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have some time for questions. We'll just sit at the dais. If you have a question, please identify yourself and wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Terry Miller from the Heritage Foundation. I guess this is a question really for Bill. You laid out a vision of the Chinese economy in which there were a lot of distortions, overinvestment, perhaps over exporting, massive holding of American debt. And in this global agenda, we're proposing that China undertake serious changes in its model. And my question is, are the Chinese economy and the U.S. economy so intertwined that if in fact China does undertake reforms and change its economic model, is that in turn going to force the United States to undertake reforms and in some respects change our model?
Yeah, right now, actually, the U.S. trade deficit with China is $300 billion. So it's the Chinese benefit disproportionately with bilateral trade with the U.S. They do hold 1.4 trillion in U.S. debt, but the U.S. has no problem selling its debt. So I don't think a hard landing necessarily would cause the U.S. or pressure to the U.S. to implement structural reforms. For example, reaching a grand bargain that we've been waiting for years. But if you look at China, though, what we're asking the Chinese to do, something we've asked no one else to do, no one else has ever accomplished before. For 30 years, the Chinese economic mode has been a result of their export share has gone from 2% of global trade to 10% of global exports. Investment now is 50% of GDP. And so the local governments and these state-owned enterprises are extremely powerful with great entrenched interests who have benefited disproportionately. The elites have over the last 35 years. So what we're asking the Chinese to do then is make a massive transfer of income and power from the state-owned enterprises and local governments to the household sector in a relatively short period of time. This is extremely unlikely. I don't think the entrenched interest in China will get around to doing this with great rapidity, which is why I think a crisis in China is inevitable. China needs a crisis first. China needs a hard landing first before they implement economic reforms. My mentor when I was a younger economist, David Lippman at the bank, had an expression, cheer up, Bill, things are getting worse. It's my thesis that nation states, whether they're developed or developing, have to go through a crisis to implement structural reforms. This is why this is why much of the emerging world, which grew so fast last decade as a result of higher commodity prices, easy credit conditions, the OECD countries where most of their exports were going to were growing at twice the pace they were now. In 2007, the World Bank says there's 145 emerging or developing countries. In 2007, only 3 countries were in recession. They were floating on a sea of higher commodity prices, higher mineral prices, and higher farm prices. You will never replicate those conditions again anytime soon. And so I think not only China, but much of the emerging world is getting its comeuppance and will be forced to make structural reforms over the next few years. Watch India over the next 12 months. That may be the biggest story.
Okay. Next, other questions in the back?
Hi, Jackie Northam with NPR. I'm trying to understand, the news as you were talking about last week that came out that China is going to surpass the U.S. or has. It depends what arithmetic you use on this, the U.S. economy and that. And I'm really trying to actually understand what that means in U.S. terms. In other words, is it just a loss of stature if this happens, or is there sort of a knock-on effect? Are there really tangible effects of this? We have sort of the gold standards and the laws, not that we always adhere to them, but that kind of thing. I'm really trying to understand what this means.
Yeah, it's a technical the purchasing power parity formula is a very technical process. For example, when I lived in China for 3 years, I have a maid come in twice a month. I'm a slob. And I probably paid 1/10 the price for a maid in China, in Beijing, than I did in the US. But the level of quality was roughly the same. Taxi services in Beijing, were a fraction of the price than they are in the US, but the level of quality right now is roughly the same. So what these statistical organizations, including the World Bank, went in and took into account the much lower price levels in China and looked at real output and said that, gee, the Chinese have caught up and that by 2014 they'll be larger in real terms, not at exchange rates. Now, it's only a formula, and so what was released last week really doesn't change anything. In fact, the Chinese didn't like it. The Chinese didn't participate in this program because they don't want to be known as being as large as the United States because it requires them to take a lot more responsibility on the world stage. For example, when the Philippine typhoon hit 3 months ago, they only sent $100 million to the Philippines. They don't want to participate. They're at the stage yet where they don't want to participate fully on the global stage, so they don't want to be labeled as big.
What I'm trying to get at is, the U.S. is not from its perch as the largest economy in the world. Does that actually mean anything, and all of a sudden China is the biggest one? Is there anything that actually changes if that happens?
This has been an ongoing process since the global crisis began in 2008. I've been living abroad since 2007, and the U.S. has lost a lot of its status in terms of world economic leadership. So this has been an ongoing process now for 5-10 years. There's something else I wanted to say on this topic, but I forgot.
Certainly in terms of per capita income, it's...
Yeah, the U.S. Is still, in terms of comparing China with the U.S., our per capita income is still 5 times higher than China's. It will take China at least 30-40 years to close that gap, even at an assumption of high growth rates. And the income inequality in China is enormous. In fact, if the government knew what the true income inequality was, what economists call the Gini coefficient, they wouldn't publish it. There's been such an enormous increase in income inequality, which is why they want to transition to a new economic model. But I think longer term too, the Chinese are only spending like 2 to 2.5% of GDP, stated GDP, on national defense. Now they can say they can spend a lot more money on national defense because their economy is so much bigger. It gives the Mandarins leeway to increase defense spending because their economy is so much larger, stated to be so much larger now.
Yeah, I think, Heritage has done a lot of good work on the allegations of stagnant wage growth or income growth in the United States in the last 20 or 30 years. And if you look at the quality of products, of goods and services that people can now enjoy for less money than before, that's another sort of aspect of purchasing power parity that would have to be factored in. So, we have another question? Sir.
I'm Andres Martinez with Heritage. I had a question about what the future crisis in China, how that may affect China's business abroad in terms of investing and getting resources, natural resources, or just their general business abroad. How that might, whether that would expand in an attempt to offset the damage from a crisis, or if that would force them to kind of recede from the world economically.
One thing about, one of the immediate effects is about China's growth. It's going to fall. It's a question of time. In the last 2 years, it's already fallen from 10% to 7%. That's a 30% drop. That's a pretty precipitous drop over a short period of time. Also, too, remember about China, its growth is becoming a lot less commodity intensive than it was before. Last quarter, for the first time in Chinese history, believe it or not, the service sector now is larger than the manufacturing and construction sectors combined. So the rebalancing process has already started. It's just not moving fast enough. But under a hard landing scenario, China is a huge importer of raw materials. They became a net importer of oil back in 1997. The Chinese now import 7 million barrels of oil a day. So you'd see a pretty sharp drop in commodity prices. So the big commodity exporters like Indonesia, Peru, and Brazil would suffer disproportionately, as they benefited disproportionately last decade from 10% economic growth in China. So big commodity exporters would be damaged. But you look at India and you look at China right now, they're big net importers of commodities, 4 to 5% of GDP. So they would benefit from lower prices, and that would offset some of the damage.
Brian Riley work here at Heritage, and as much as I hate two-part questions, I have a two-part question. Part one, if we come back in 5 years, do you think will you predict the arrows are pointing up or down for Asia? And part two, if you're giving advice to the United States, maybe, I know, John, you've listed several things the U.S. could do that are in the agenda, but if you could give maybe one policy suggestion to the United States to promote economic freedom in the region, what would that be? So I'll let you take a stab at either or both of those. Thank you.
Maybe John first.
Well, of course, the example is important, and there's no, setting a good example of economic policies. But I think I come back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership as really a once-in-a-generation opportunity here, and it has given the potential of some influence, a little leverage to the United States that we've, and without it, it's hard to know what we would have to offer this. We have the improved access to the U.S. marketplace that countries want. So, for instance, Vietnam wants to sell its apparel duty-free into the U.S. market, and footwear, and other countries have other priorities. This is an opportunity for us to push for the kinds of economic policy reforms that I was describing in my remarks there about the rules on fair play with state-owned enterprises, due process and antitrust, and of course the simple market access that can be so valuable. And it's really an important moment. It's the notion that if we're not careful, someone will draw a line down the middle of the Pacific, to use a line from Jim Baker back when he was Secretary of State. I think it's a real concern. In the Asia-Pacific region, there are negotiations going on known as the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which bring together really every country in East Asia, from India, China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, but not the United States. So for the TPP, it gives us a piece of the action. It ensures that we're on the inside and not on the outside. So it's important for the U.S., for U.S. companies to have that access. But it's an opportunity to, I think, hopefully set a good tone for economic policies that promote economic freedom.
Just a quick comment. We haven't mentioned geopolitical tensions, which I'm not an expert on, but after living in China for over 3 years, it's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. What's going on in the East and South China Sea? Even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, at the height of the Cold War, we still had the U.S. still had dialogue with the Soviet Union. We were always talking with the Soviets during any crisis. There was always dialogue. We have no idea what the Chinese are doing. There's very little dialogue. The Chinese are the Chinese are the riddle wrapped inside
The enigma.
the dumpling, in this case. And so, I would reread Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August. It's a series of mistakes. The fact is that we don't communicate very well with the Chinese, and the Chinese don't communicate very well with us. In my 3 years in China, I didn't get close to any Chinese. I tried, but I didn't. The cultural differences were too great. So I think if your question, looking 5 years from now, you're looking at a much more prosperous Asia if you get the structural reforms, assuming there's not war.
Well, on that happy note.
I wonder if I could just jump in, maybe on a little more hopeful note, though. We see signs of change, and maybe it's because I'm a trade policy guy. I come back to this, that there's a recognition in China of the opportunities here. They're following the TPP with great interest, expressed some fascination and possibly a desire to join that negotiation at some point. They've already stated explicitly they would like to join the Trade and Services Agreement. And they see that these would meet the goals that were articulated at the third plenum last year, that of moving towards less heavy industry, more towards services. So things are in play and in a positive way in some fashion there. So I would be a little more hopeful about the path ahead. It seems like the bigger risks come from some of the more unpredictable actors like North Korea and Iran and so on, or for that matter, Russia. In Asia, I think a lot of businesses are very much betting on continued growth.
Well, it seems likely we won't solve all the problems we raised in our 2014 agenda, so we'll look forward to the 2015 global agenda also and see what the report is. And also just to remind you that we will have events on other regions of the world covered in our global agenda in the next few weeks. So again, please join me in thanking our panelists.